Karen shows up late to her own meeting, claims to be sick, and ultimately resigns, leading to legal threats that blow up in her face. This narrative contains elements of spiteful compliance intertwined with ongoing retribution, which is why I decided to share it here. First, a standard cautionary note for those who may be sensitive about such matters on mobile. English is not my first language. This is a lengthy account without a summary. Feel free to engage with someone else. Secondly, please note that this account involves legal matters, thus names and identifiable information have been altered. Now for the engaging part, this story dates back approximately 5 years, and some aspects, as you will discover towards the end, are still unfolding, likely to continue for an extended period. It begins with Mrs. P, who serves as the principal, as that is her role. Mrs. P began her career as a special needs caregiver, continuing her studies throughout her years of service, ultimately earning a doctorate in special education. After 2 decades in this field, she was invited by the council of a medium-sized city to establish and manage a new special needs school within the community. She accepted the position, and after 4 years, she successfully created a school with 150 students, which is an impressive figure for a specialized education institution. Such schools require significantly more staff than conventional schools. They need not only teachers but also additional caregivers, and the work is often challenging and messy. Therefore, Mrs. P was constantly on the lookout for new hires. Then came Karen. Karen had just completed her college education, graduating at the top of her class in educational consulting. Her professor, who served on Mrs. P's school board, spoke highly of her, leading to her being essentially hired even before she submitted her resume. Karen is married to Kevin, who also graduated with distinction, ranking within the top 5 of his law class. He is currently doing an internship at a prestigious law firm, eagerly awaiting his license to practice law. Their future seemed bright and clear, as long as they avoided significant mistakes on their way to a comfortable, prosperous life. Mrs. P welcomed Karen to the school, informing her that she would begin work on August 20, just a week prior to the commencement of the academic year, as staff needed to prepare the school for opening. Karen protested, arguing that she was a consultant, not just another worker there to perform menial tasks. This attitude frustrated Mrs. P, yet given Karen's impressive qualifications, she maintained her composure and stated, "Staff will start working on August 20, and you are part of the staff, so be here on that date." Karen was displeased, but ultimately accepted the situation. The week leading up to the school's opening remains unforgettable for the staff. While teachers, nurses, and various staff members collaborated diligently to prepare the school, painting walls, assembling furniture, and performing tasks not usually covered in college training, Karen isolated herself in her office, engaged only with her phone. Unsurprisingly, she did not win many friends among her colleagues. As time progressed, the school opened on schedule and routines were established. However, Karen started to generate increasing problems. She consistently refused to complete standard reports regarding her activities, was often unavailable for meetings with other staff and parents, and her overall demeanor was that of an excessively entitled individual. Mrs. P made numerous attempts to discuss these issues with her, but to no avail. Ultimately, Mrs. P reached out to the professor who had awarded Karen her degree, asking him to meet with her daily and mentor her on how to effectively function in a real school environment, given her apparent lack of such skills coming out of college. Even this intervention proved ineffective. Karen became widely disliked by the staff, and her performance continued to deteriorate weekly. Mrs. P organized weekly meetings with Karen and the professor to evaluate her progress and suggest improvements. Meanwhile, significant reports and essential documents went unfiled, and the care provided to students was increasingly subpar. Eventually, a parent lodged a complaint concerning the inadequate treatment their child received, prompting the school board to take notice. A meeting was scheduled with the board, Mrs. P, and Karen, where the professor assured Karen that if she could organize her paperwork and maintain a respectful attitude, everything would be fine. Karen recognized the gravity of the situation, but couldn't suppress her entitled behavior. When the day of the meeting arrived, Karen failed to appear without any notification, not showing up that day, nor the following day, nor the week thereafter. With Karen absent, the board could only listen to Mrs. Ptika's account, which they already understood, leading to a delay in the meeting until Karen could be present. This delay certainly did not benefit her case. Meanwhile, Mrs. P and the professor attempted to reach Karen by phone, but their calls went directly to voicemail. Eventually, Mrs. P had no choice. Since Karen had been absent and uncommunicative for over a week, she required a solid explanation to prevent termination. She called Karen, leaving a voicemail expressing concern due to Karen's prolonged silence, and urgently requested that she get in touch as soon as possible since the finance department was considering cutting her pay. Finally, Karen returned the call. She informed Mrs. P that she had been ill the entire time and would be returning to work in 2 days. Great, Mrs. P marked her calendar and scheduled a meeting with both the professor and Karen first thing in the morning. If Karen could produce a doctor's note, she wouldn't face termination, but she would receive a stern talk regarding her failure to notify anyone. The day arrived, and Mrs. P and the professor waited in her office for Karen to arrive. But she never did. Mrs. P tried calling her, but once more it went to voicemail. Furious, and with the professor equally annoyed, they felt that Karen had set a new record for wasting everyone's time. When Karen finally showed up 2 hours late, Mrs. P called her in for a meeting immediately. She summoned the professor, who had canceled prior engagements to attend, and the meeting eventually began 3 hours late. Fortunately, Karen had a doctor's note, so she was covered on that front, but it meant she was now subject to a stern discussion about her conduct. Approximately 10 minutes into the meeting, Karen broke down in tears. The meeting paused briefly to allow for calming down, but it was not yet finished. After a few moments, everyone returned to the room and Karen stated, "I still feel unwell, I want to go home now." Mrs. P remained silent, while the professor remarked, "As a board member, I have to say as long as you are sick, your job is secure, but given that this is your first year, you have not accrued any sick days or vacation days. You will not receive payment for this." Karen merely responded, "We will see about that," gathered her belongings and left. Karen remained absent for an additional 2 weeks, leaving her position vacant. Mrs. P did her best to fill the gap as did others, but it was evident that someone was missing and the position required attention. Eventually, Mrs. P reached out to Karen again to inquire about her health and her return date. When Karen mentioned that she could no longer handle the pressure and intended to resign, Mrs. P was taken aback. Resigning in the middle of her first year would jeopardize Karen's future, and finding another consultant mid-academic year would be incredibly difficult. Nevertheless, she kept her thoughts to herself, simply stating that she didn't believe it was necessary or wise and urged Karen to recover and return. However, Karen did not come back, and after another 2 weeks of absence, Kevin called to ask why no payment had been issued. He received the clear answer Karen had no entitlement to paid sick leave, which made him furious and led him to threaten legal action, which in legal parlance indicates, "I intend to sue you." It was evident that their relationship with the school had deteriorated and Karen would not be returning. Mrs. P began searching for a replacement, although the options were far from ideal. Eventually, she managed to persuade a retired consultant to return for the remainder of the academic year. The new hire began working but encountered payment issues since the position was still officially held by Karen, who remained on sick leave. Board members began contacting Karen, recognizing that she would not communicate with Mrs. P. They urged her to return, and when she refused, they requested that she submit her resignation to enable the school to continue functioning. Karen argued that she was only willing to return if she was compensated for all her sick leave, but no one was prepared to agree to that. The situation escalated, becoming increasingly chaotic, and parents began to overhear rumors about the turmoil, creating a negative atmosphere. Eventually, Kevin, Karen's spouse, called to state his intention to sue the school for payment. He was directed to the city's lawyers, who explained that Karen could not pursue a lawsuit against the school or the city while still on sick leave or remaining an employee. She needed to terminate one of these conditions. The following day, Karen appeared at the school with a standard resignation letter, attributing her resignation to mental and health issues caused by the toxic environment. After more than 2 months, the position was finally vacated and quickly filled. What had previously been mere speculation had turned into reality, and parents recognized that something had occurred. In a group chat among parents that included Mrs. P, they inquired about the situation. Mrs. P replied that Karen had resigned due to her mental health issues. Kevin attempted to sue the city, which proceeded to mediation before any court hearing. The mediator reviewed the materials and strongly advised Kevin to withdraw his complaint. He complied, and the entire conflict was soon forgotten for a time. 3 months later, while the school was functioning adequately, an email from Karen landed in Mrs. P's inbox. In succinct, legalistic language, Karen informed Mrs. P that she was aware of the slander she had engaged in publicly and possessed screenshots as evidence that Mrs. P had claimed she had mental health issues, which was entirely untrue. Karen demanded that Mrs. P publicly apologize and clarify that there were no mental health problems and that her resignation stemmed from professional disputes. Mrs. P was taken aback, fully aware that Karen was, to put it mildly, not entirely stable mentally. Her resignation letter substantiated that, and Karen's reversal was inexplicably foolish. Nonetheless, Mrs. P appropriately escalated the matter to the school board, soliciting their guidance on the best course of action. Upon hearing the term, legal actions, the school board reacted with alarm. They wanted nothing to do with a lawsuit. They insisted that Mrs. P simply apologize to put the issue to rest, but she was unwilling to concede any wrongdoing since she believed she had acted correctly. The board expressed their frustration, insisting that Mrs. P was being needlessly obstinate, stating they would not cover any legal expenses related to this matter, which contradicted Mrs. P's contract, as the legal liabilities she had within her role were the responsibility of her employer. This put Mrs. P's job at risk, and she was determined to defend herself and prevail. However, without the city's resources, defending against a slander lawsuit would be expensive, and her job was in jeopardy, making the situation even more precarious. Mrs. P returned to the parents' forum to inform them that she was facing personal legal complications and inquired whether anyone could assist her. One parent, who happened to be a lawyer, generously offered to help without charge. It is generally considered highly unprofessional to seek help from parents regarding personal matters, but this situation undeniably pertained to the school context, and the lawyer-parent recognized that upon hearing the details. The lawyer confirmed that Karen and Kevin had no grounds to file a lawsuit, but noted that if they were sending the email, it indicated their intention to sue regardless. He advised Mrs. P to ignore their threats and allow them to dig their own grave. And dig they did. A week after the initial email, a new letter arrived through regular mail, nestled in an envelope. It was printed on Kevin's law firm letterhead, stating that the matter should be addressed with a public apology or legal action would ensue. Even the lawyer was incredulous that someone from a reputable law firm could act so foolishly, but the letter served as undeniable proof. A trial would be time-consuming and costly, even with his pro bono assistance, and Mrs. P would likely be terminated no matter the outcome. They needed an alternative solution. The lawyer concluded that the foolish actions necessitated unconventional measures, pondering for a moment until he remembered a college classmate who worked for the same firm. He contacted his former classmate to catch up after their years apart. Surprisingly, he discovered that his friend had worked diligently to achieve the position of junior partner at the firm. Upon mentioning the case to him, his friend was bewildered. He had not heard of it, which was peculiar, as gossip travels rapidly in large law firms. Especially regarding a slander case against a special education school, it was sensational news. Such a lawsuit would also generate public relations challenges. He and other partners would never want to be associated with a case like that, as it would tarnish their reputation. He vowed to investigate and uncover what was happening within the firm. It didn't take long. The next day, the lawyer called back and shared what he discovered. No one at the firm was aware of the case. Kevin likely misused the firm's letterhead to send the letter, but no higher-up lawyers were involved. This discovery was excellent news for Mrs. P. Together, the lawyer and Mrs. P crafted a response to Kevin and Karen that would effectively dismiss them once and for all. The lawyer contacted Mrs. P to relay his plan, which was straightforward, effective, and delightfully vindictive. Although Mrs. P had reservations about it, she ultimately agreed, recognizing it was the most efficient means to resolve the complications. Next, the lawyer drafted a settlement agreement and reached out to Kevin to gauge his reaction. The agreement stipulated that Mrs. P would publicly apologize to Karen in the most public manner possible and post all legally related documents alongside the apology on the school's website. It further specified that the apology could take any form as long as it was searchable on Google and included a link from the school's website. Additionally, it stated that after the apology, Karen and Kevin would relinquish any right to sue the school in the future and would have no further claims against either Mrs. P or the school. The final clause stipulated that should any unrelated issues arise from this agreement, Karen and Kevin would be held accountable for any consequences, with the school entitled to seek restitution for any losses suffered. Kevin agreed to all the terms, and within 2 hours, both he and Karen signed the agreement, paving the way for the next steps. The lawyer arrived at Mrs. P's office equipped with the necessary equipment and the apology script. He set up a video camera, and Mrs. P proceeded to read her apology. She began by introducing herself, detailing her career achievements, degrees, and endorsements. She then provided an introduction for Karen, outlining her brief career thus far, without any recommendations. Following this backdrop, she articulated that Karen had resigned from the school due to professional disagreements. While any comments made by Mrs. P or anyone else concerning Karen's mental health issues were untrue, and Mrs. P expressed regret if Karen or anyone else had been affected by such comments. In essence, anyone watching the video would comprehend who Karen truly was, and although Mrs. P did not explicitly state it, it was evident she held a low opinion of Karen. Immediately after filming, the video was uploaded to the school's YouTube channel, and a subsite was created on the school's website displaying the video alongside all pertinent documents, including the threatening letter Kevin had sent on his firm's stationery. A link conveying a concise message was sent to Kevin. "This resolves the matter. Do not contact us again." Karen and Kevin believed they had won the battle. A month later, however, Kevin was unexpectedly dismissed from his firm. It turned out that he had overstepped his authority by sending a threat on the firm's letterhead without approval from higher-ups. Conducting such actions under false pretenses constituted fraud. To prevent a major scandal or public relations calamity, he was merely let go without any additional sanctions. The firm issued a letter to the school acknowledging Kevin's fraudulent actions and requesting the removal of Kevin's threatening letter. The school graciously complied, removing Kevin's letter but instead publishing the firm's letter, which detailed Kevin's misconduct. Kevin's career was effectively finished. Any law firm he approached for employment would inquire why he had left his previous prestigious firm before even completing the first stage of hiring. A simple search of his name brought up evidence of his fraud against a special education institution, making him an untenable candidate for any reputable law firm. Meanwhile, Karen continued her job search in her field, but had to wait until the new academic year began. Her former college professor was unprepared to provide her with a recommendation, forcing her to account for the gap in her resume during interviews with various principals. Several of those principals had heard negative feedback about her from Mrs. P and decided to contact her regarding Karen's employment, to which Mrs. P responded that, due to legal limitations, she could not discuss Karen, and everything was explained in the legal section of the school's website. This was sufficient, as any principal aware of Karen's recent legal troubles would be wary of hiring her. Consequently, Karen lost the academic year and began exploring alternative job opportunities. She eventually found a position as a secretary in an office that did not conduct a Google search on her name, working there for several months until the manager, bored one day, decided to research Karen. She was terminated the following day for a minor infraction. More than 5 years have passed since these events took place. Kevin now works as a lawyer in a disreputable firm that serves largely criminal clients, losing most of his court cases and earning a reputation as a low-tier lawyer catering to immoral figures. Karen is still seeking employment, struggling to remain in any position for longer than 6 months before being dismissed for trivial reasons. Both of them are acutely aware of the reasons behind their misfortunes. Recently, Kevin sent another threatening letter demanding the removal of all mentions of their names from the school's website, in addition to requesting the deletion of the video. The lawyer informed him that these stipulations were part of what he had agreed to, and should Kevin wish to renegotiate, he would be required to cover damages. He did not elaborate on what damages would entail, and Kevin chose not to pursue the matter further, conceding defeat alongside Karen. They accepted their loss in this battle. Eventually, Mrs. P removed the video from the school's website and set it to private on YouTube, yet all legal letters remain publicly posted there, likely to endure indefinitely.